This video is going to cover a lot, if not most, of the maintenance items on the NA and NB Miata, at least in the engine compartment, and here's the full list. But before we get into the content, let me just say, this is going to be the longest video that I've ever made. It took weeks to edit this, and I spent so much time because I sincerely wanted to be a useful guide, a maintenance bible, if you will, to the engine compartment for NA and NB Miatas. Therefore, I put timestamps on the video so you can skip around to the parts of the video that you'll find helpful yourself. I'm really not expecting anyone to watch this entire thing, although I don't think you'll regret it if you do. And one more thing before we begin. If you're new to the Miata or the hobby, I strongly suggest you pick up this book, Mazda Miata MX-5 Performance Projects by Keith Tanner. I read this thing from cover to cover, probably multiple times, and it's incredibly helpful for both maintenance tasks and common upgrades that you might consider doing to your Project Miata. The product link is in the description, and let's go ahead and get started. Let's start by putting Marty on jackstands. Because lifting the Miata up on jackstands safely and without causing damage to the frame is surprisingly hard to do, I made a separate video on this which you can find in the description. By the way, saying this is going to get annoying pretty quick, so whenever I have a relevant deep dive video made specifically about a topic, I'll go ahead and indicate it with this marker on the screen, and they will all be linked in the description. We will also go ahead and disconnect the battery in the trunk since we're going to be touching a lot of wiring and we don't want to cause any damage to the electrical components. We'll now drain the engine oil and the coolant. Pop open the hood and remove the oil filler cap and the radiator cap. My radiator cap is quite crusty and the coolant smells really foul, which is not a great sign. Moving to the bottom of the car, we'll go ahead and remove this plastic panel, which is easy enough to do by removing a few bolts here and there. My splash shield is pretty brittle and it shows signs of an oil leak. We can talk more about that in a second. And it's damaged, probably from a previous owner using a jack that slipped off the front crossmember. It looks like it's leaking oil from a few different spots, but no worries, taking care of these leaks is part of the agenda today, and hopefully as we progress we'll find the exact source of those leaks and be able to address them. We'll drain the oil now. It should be an either 17 or 19mm plug. Hopefully you pulled out about 3 to 4 quarts of oil that is black and free of large metal particles. Let's put a new crush ring on the plug and tighten it to 25 foot-pounds, and if you don't have a torque wrench, just put it snug but don't over tighten. By the way, I'm well aware that some people think it's ridiculous that I use a torque wrench to tighten an oil plug, but hey, I have it anyways, why not use it? Now let's drain the coolant. If you have a stock radiator, there should be a plastic Phillips plug in the center bottom of the radiator. And my coolant is just awful. It stinks, it's pretty much near black, and it's full of rust. The good thing is that there's no oil in there, at least I got that going for me, but I can tell that this car was sitting still for a very long time for some time period in the past. We'll most likely have to replace this radiator, but we can address that later. We should reinstall the plug back onto the radiator so that we don't lose it, and now all the prep work is done. We can remove the upper radiator hose by loosening up a couple of clamps and twisting it loose. If yours is a little stuck, go ahead and use a flathead screwdriver to pry it off. Just be careful if you're planning to reuse it. Next up is a front air hose. Start by removing the vacuum line that runs across the hose and putting it out of the way. As far as the air hose itself is concerned, it's not that intuitive which clamps and bolts you need to address to remove this assembly, so I'm pointing it out here. We're going to remove the radiator and fan assembly to get a lot more space for us to work. We can disconnect the fan wiring. There should be 2 plugs, one for each fan. Then disconnect the lower hose from the radiator. Just have a bucket underneath to catch the coolant. It's also a good idea to shove some paper towels into the hole so it doesn't drip all over the place as you remove the radiator. The radiator itself is held on by 2 bolts on each side, which should be pretty straightforward to remove. Once they are removed, you can also detach the coolant hose that runs to the overflow reservoirs, set that aside, and carefully pull up on the radiator and fan assembly. I stress carefully because it is easy to mangle the fins on the radiator if it brushes up on something on the way up. This radiator is pretty completely shot though, and I'll most likely be replacing it anyway. We'll pause here to identify some components. Starting from the right, you have a belt that connects the crankshaft of the engine with the power steering pump and the AC compressor if you have that option. The belt that is behind that connects the crankshaft to the alternator and the water pump. The engine powers all these components through these 2 belts. To check the tension on the belts, if you press it down with your thumb, you should get about a 1/4 inch of flex. This first belt seems fine, but this alternator belt seems way too loose, and a loose belt like this will slip and squeal. Have them too tight though, and the pulley bearing might get damaged. We're going to be replacing these belts anyway, so let's start by loosening up the tension bolts and nuts that I'm pointing at right now, right above the power steering pump. There's another nut that needs to be loosened to pivot the power steering pump pulley, and you might have to rotate the engine to get access to it depending on how the pulley is currently positioned. You can rotate the crank pulley directly by putting a socket wrench on the crank bolt. Rotate the engine until you have easy access to the nut. Just make sure you're in neutral to allow the engine to actually rotate. After that, you can loosen up all 4 of the bolts and nuts, and everything should flex enough for you to pry the old belt loose. If you do have an impact drill or a compact impact wrench, they will come in handy throughout this job, although there's nothing wrong with good old hand tools. Taking off the alternator belt is pretty similar, although now it's the alternator that pivots to serve as a tensioner instead of the power steering pump. There are 2 bolts at the bottom of the alternator, and if you loosen those, the alternator will be able to swing and pivot, and then there's 2 more fasteners near the top of the alternator that is used to actually tension the belt. Loose all 4 again, and the belt should eventually become loose enough for you to pull out of the pulley groove. Now we're going to try to take off this water pump pulley, which is just 3 bolts. The thing will try to spin on you, so try to hold it still while letting the impact tool do the work. To take off the valve cover, first the ignition coil that sits near the firewall needs to be removed, so we'll unplug the spark plug wires and also disconnect the plugs that hook up the ignition coil. You'll notice throughout the video that I'm using a bunch of different brightly colored masking tape to mark which plug goes where, and also to serve as a visual indicator or a reminder that it needs to be reconnected come assembly time. The ignition coil itself has 2 bolts on either side of it, which is easy work, but there's a bolt right next to the firewall in the back that is an absolute pain to get to, and it took me no less than an hour to remove because I couldn't get more than like 10 degrees of rotation with my box wrench each time. If you can get it out, you can lift out the entire assembly. We can then remove the spark plugs, and if you have a spark plug specific socket, that's awesome. If not, any deep socket with some tape will do fine. I like to keep the old spark plugs after marking which cylinder it came out of, so I can examine them later to see if there's anything I can tell about how the engine is running. It can tell you a surprising amount of information, which I won't get into here, but long story short, you want to see marshmallow toast coloration. We're now going to disconnect the PCV valve. I think it stands for positive crankcase ventilation, and this valve allows pressure to escape back into the intake manifold. We're going to now release all the valve cover bolts, and the order doesn't really matter here. Just don't bother with these 2 bolts here, as they don't actually go into the engine head, and they're just there to hold this tube down. Once all of the bolts are loose, you can lift the the valve cover out very carefully. You just don't want any dust or debris falling into the engine. If yours is especially dirty, it might have been worthwhile to vacuum the whole thing before this step. I'm shoving paper towels down the spark plug holes to keep things out of the cylinders. I made this mistake once, and it's not something that I ever want to do again. We'll pause again here to identify a few more things before we move on. We can now see the inside of the head of the engine where the two overhead camshafts can be seen. The one on the driver's side is the exhaust camshaft, and the one on the passenger side is the intake camshaft. There's the CAS, or camshaft angle sensor, which we'll address later in the video, and we can also now take a look at the camshaft gears or sprockets, one on each camshaft that rotates via the timing belt. The head overall seems to be in pretty darn good condition, and I don't really see much to be worried about here. Before we take off anything else, it'll be helpful for us to find a TDC, or top dead center, of the engine and then lock it down. TDC refers to the exact position where the engine is at 0 degrees rotation, or when the first piston reaches its peak point. I'm going to stick an extension in here to see the position of the first piston. Just make sure that it's squeaky clean before you do, and then rotate the engine clockwise before it starts falling again. I'm also checking to see that the timing mark is exactly at 0 degrees at the crank pulley, and if you need even more assurance, both I and E on the camshaft gears should be at the 12 o'clock positions. Once you got it right, go ahead and put the engine in 5th gear to prevent it from turning, and pull the E-brake as well. Now that the crankshaft is locked from moving from the TDC position, we can go ahead and remove the crankshaft pulley. Ignore the large bolt in the middle, we'll get to that in a second. The pulley comes off when you remove the 4 smaller bolts. There's also a shim, which, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure why that exists. Just make sure you don't lose it. I didn't have too much trouble taking the pulley off the crankshaft, but it does look like there's quite a lot of rust. So what I'm going to do is actually dunk this pulley in a rubber safe rust dissolver for a day or so, see if that helps. And we can check on that in a bit. We're now about to remove the crankshaft bolt, but before we proceed, I should explain why I'm removing this, because this step will be unnecessary in most cases. This bolt keeps the crankshaft sprocket in place, which turns the timing belt. You do not have to remove this bolt or the sprocket to do a timing belt change. However, I'm choosing to remove both this bolt and later on the sprocket for 2 reasons. One, I suspect that the front crankshaft seal, which is behind the sprocket, is leaking oil, and 2, I know that I have a short-nose crankshaft, which I believe is only relevant for 1990 to 91 1.6 liter engines, and it's a very common issue that the nose of the crankshaft becomes damaged over time and causes the timing to slip. So that's what I really want to check. I'll explain a little bit more about this later, but again, I just wanted to do a quick pause here to explain that some of this disassembly may not be necessary for everyone. Okay, with that PSA out of the way, we can now get the large bolt, which I think is a 21mm bolt if I remember correctly. This is a bolt that's probably rusted stuck and thread locked, so you're gonna want to break out the big impact wrench if you have one. If you don't, you definitely need at least a breaker bar or a very long handle wrench. There's absolutely 0 chance you're getting this thing off with a regular wrench. There's some more shims that you can take out also if you haven't done so already. It looks like it just keeps as much debris away from the sprocket as possible. Last bit of PSA, if you're going to be doing this also, it's not recommended that you reuse the crankshaft bolt, so go ahead and pick up a new one. Since we're going to be replacing the thermostat, we can go ahead and open up the housing. There's nothing too tricky about this other than the fact that the left side bolt holds down a cable clamp, which seems like the perfect thing to forget to reattach later. Hardened gasket is going to be holding this cap down, so you might need some gentle knocks with a mallet to get it off. Just don't hit the coolant temp sensor right at the top. Thermostat changes are one of those why not just replace it while you're in there type deals. It's pretty inexpensive, so you might as well just do it. There's also a cable that runs across to the power steering pump that's going to be in the way for this next step, so go ahead and disconnect that too. The timing belt is protected by 3 pieces of plastic engine covers that is held onto the block with a few bolts, and there's nothing too complicated to explain here, so I'll just let you guys look at what I'm doing. I would suggest that you take careful note of where each of the bolts go and what they're holding. I don't really recall if they were all the same lengths, but some of the bolts are holding something like a hose holder, not sure what those things are called, so take note of those. One more thing, if you're looking to replace these plastic covers, Mazda includes the rubber gaskets with the plastic pieces that they go on, so there you go, hopefully that's helpful. Oh, and to take this bottom piece off, you do have to remove this coolant hose that goes to the thermostat housing, which I forgot to take off earlier, so go ahead and pop that off if you haven't done so already. Other than that, easy peasy. We're about to take the timing belt off, but there's one more coolant hose that connects to the thermostat housing. Go ahead and disconnect that. Just have a bucket underneath to catch the coolant, and after this we should all be good and ready to go to take the timing belt off. Okay, another quick PSA before we do this. Remember how we put the engine exactly at TDC? Well, this is the exact position in which the timing belt needs to be installed. But once we remove this belt, the camshafts will be free to rotate on their own. I don't particularly care because I want to set the valve timing to exactly how I want it, but it's going to be a major unnecessary pain in the ass if all you're doing is a timing belt change and you don't want the camshaft gears to rotate out of position on you. There's all kinds of tricks online about how to hold the camshafts still using a combination of box wrenches and clamps and all kinds of stuff like that, but what I would actually suggest is that you buy a specific tool for this. If you search camshaft sprocket holder for Miata, you should be able to find something like this, and it'll just save you so much time and hassle, and it's like 10 bucks. The timing belt itself is tensioned by a pulley, and there's a couple of pulleys, but it's the one that is being pulled by a spring that you need to pay attention to. So what you need to do is loosen the bolt, which should allow the pulley to move, push the pulley outward to give the belt some slack, and lock it down, the pulley again in that position. You should now be able to pull the belt off the gears. We're now going to take the camshaft gears off of the camshaft by loosening up the bolt that holds it in, and since I don't want the camshaft spinning freely with my impact wrench, I'm holding it still with a wrench. There's a hexagonal area that you should use, and under no circumstances should you touch any other part of the camshaft with a wrench. Again, I'm not trying to keep this from moving at all, I'm only trying to keep it from spinning freely. I'm working on the intake camshaft first, but go ahead and remove the exhaust side gear as well. And fun fact, these two are identical gears. There's no intake or exhaust specific camshaft gears, and they can be installed in either position as long as the I is pointing upwards on the intake side and E is pointing upwards on the exhaust side. And now you can see the camshaft seals that we wanted to get to and replace eventually, which we'll do that later in the video, but for now we'll continue with the disassembly by removing the thermostat. The thermostat can be pried loose with a flathead screwdriver, and since we're going to be replacing this anyway, I just suggest that you put a screwdriver through it and lever it out since it's going to be stuck pretty good in there. Let's go ahead and remove the timing belt pulleys now, and there's nothing much to this other than 2 bolts, but do note that one of the pulleys, the one on the passenger side, is tensioned by a spring, so make sure you note how everything hangs together before you pull it off. Timing belt change kits usually come with new springs, but if it doesn't, you're going to want to reuse that spring. By the way, if it seems like I'm skipping around a lot, it's because I kind of am. I just had a long list of things that I wanted to do, and I wasn't trying to do a specific job, so it'll look like I'm skipping around a lot. But hey, that's what the timestamping is for, so that you only watch what you think you need to. We can now move back to the crankshaft and pull the crankshaft sprocket off, and for me this was by far the biggest pain in the neck about this whole job, and you'll see why in a second. The sprocket rotates the timing chain and hence the camshaft above, and the sprocket is aligned with the nose of the crankshaft with this Woodruff key right here. And this Woodruff key is only supposed to be providing alignment, and the bolt is what's supposed to be holding the sprocket in place, so theoretically, with the bolt off, this sprocket should be sliding off pretty easily. Well, it's supposed to. The thing is, this gear is really stuck on there, and I gave up trying to pry it off. I tried using some rust dissolving lubricants, I even tried using a blowtorch to no avail. And after trying for an embarrassingly long time, I had to fashion something to bolt onto the sprocket to lever it off, which is what I'm doing right now. With a little bit of ingenuity, this ended up working out, but before it did, I got impatient and tried to lever it directly off the sprocket again, which only ended up breaking it. And I wasn't expecting to replace this sprocket, but I was able to put in a order at my local Mazda dealership parts counter. Look, I said this before, but I'll say it again, most people won't have to remove the sprocket, since the only reason that you would do that is either to get to the crankshaft seal behind it, or just to check up on the wear of the crankshaft's short nose. If you are doing this, I'd probably research if there's a specific tool for this, something like a pulley remover tool, because I would not suggest anyone do this without a specialty tool, especially if you know that it hasn't been removed for a long time and it's probably stuck on there pretty good. Here you can see the Woodruff key, which fell out when I removed the sprocket. It's just a small piece of metal which lets the sprocket move with the rotation of the crankshaft. The problem with short-nose crankshafts like the one that I have is that this slot on the crankshaft nose had a tendency to wear over time, mostly due to improper installation of the bolt. And there isn't an easy fix for this, and the end result is that your timing starts slipping. Luckily, mine seems to be doing just fine, albeit a little rusty, which I should be able to just clean off. If you do want to read up more about this short nose crank issue that affects 90 to 91 Miatas, I'll leave a link in the description. Moving back up towards the head of the engine, we're gonna remove this metal engine cover off, which you don't have to do, but I know there's a giant leak back there and I just want to give it a good wash. Now we have full access to the lower thermostat housing, and the reason why I want to remove it is to replace the O-ring that sits between this piece and the engine. Also, it'll be much easier to clean the gasket off of this housing if I can just media blast it. This is just one of those why not items in this video. This O-ring really isn't known to cause leaks, but hey, why not? I'm also planning to replace the water pump, so we'll go ahead and start removing it. This rubber gasket thing on the water pump is completely shot, but don't worry about it. I think most new water pumps come with this new, rubber piece. The water pump is held onto the block of the engine by some easily identified bolts in the front, which are simple enough, but it's also held in place and it's connected to another piece out of the side, which makes this job a little difficult. Once I take this whole thing out, you guys will be able to see exactly what I'm talking about, but just removing the front bolts are not going to free up the pump, unfortunately. So you have to remove these two bolts right here, which are basically impossible to get a good angle on. I wasn't exactly sure the easiest way to do this, so I'm just starting with the front bolts that I can see. Not all of these bolts are the same length, by the way, so take a note of where each of the bolts go. Make sure that you have a bucket underneath to catch the coolant. So now the pump is free from the block, but I still can't remove it since it's still connected to the hose on the side of it. And I know it's hard to see, but I think if I can just remove this hose clamp right here and pry that hose loose, I think I can remove the pump assembly altogether. But at this point, I'm just contemplating what I want or need to do, and I start doing the most ridiculous thing, which is to take apart everything around this hose so that I can, get a clean look at everything. Yeah, I'm mostly doing this for you guys. I want you guys to be able to see exactly how everything is connected, and I don't feel good right now with the quality of this video with all of this stuff in the way. So I'm removing the air filter box, the air hoses, and the airflow meter, and even the exhaust manifold, the heat shield, and we'll together take a good look underneath. With all this junk out of the way, we can now take a better look at how the lower radiator hose is routed to connect to the water pump. By the way, if I wasn't clear before, you don't have to do this just to replace a water pump. I'm doing it this way partially to provide a better view for you guys, like I joked about earlier, but also I want to replace these lower radiator hoses, so this is actually going to save me some time later on. And since I'm replacing the radiator hose anyway, instead of trying to pry the old hose loose and probably scraping my knuckles, I'm just choosing to cut it in half. And once it's cut, I can take out the entire water pump assembly, but really only the water pump itself will be replaced. You can now see the two bolts that I was talking about, which if you want to just replace the water pump, you should try to remove before the water pump bolts or the front ones are loosened. There's also an O-ring that goes right here that has a tendency to leak, so we'll go ahead and replace that as well. While you don't have to take out this entire assembly, I would actually maybe suggest that you do if you want to also replace this O-ring. We can now pull out the rest of the lower radiator hose assembly, and there's actually two different pieces to the lower radiator hose, and the two pieces are connected in the middle by this metal piece that gets bolted to the frame. I'm not sure why I'm holding it like I caught a fish out of a lake, but look, it's been a long day, let's just move on. Okay, we're almost done with the disassembly. I'm also gonna pull out this coolant reservoir tank since the coolant that I drained was so foul, and this tank is just very dirty and filled with crap, so I want to at least clean the crud out of it. It's held in by 3 bolts, and you'll have to wiggle free this carbon canister to pull the reservoir out. It's not that hard though. The last thing in the disassembly phase is the camshaft angle sensor, or CAS for short. Adjusting the sensor by twisting it is what controls the ignition timing, which we'll cover much later. And that's all well and good, but the CAS O-ring is notorious for causing oil leaks, and mine is definitely leaking. It's held in place with this cap and 2 bolts on either side of it, but before we remove those bolts, we'll go ahead and disconnect some plugs that connect to the CAS. There's also an adjuster screw at the back which locks the CAS in place after a timing adjustment, but just go ahead and remove the bolt after noting the rough position that the sensor is in. We'll go ahead and do a precise ignition timing adjustment later on, so marking it exactly won't be necessary. Removing the 2 bolts will free up the cap, which I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be looking at it like it's a camshaft bearing, but I suppose it looks like it's in pretty good shape. We can now take out the CAS and the O-ring that's on it, and as I've suspected, oil had been leaking pretty heavily out of there. So we'll clean all this up later, but while we do that, it's a good idea to keep the open cylinder head covered, as to minimize the dust and the debris that may fall into the head. Alright, that's all for the disassembly. Let's put this thing back together. Alright, after about an hour with some degreaser, isopropyl alcohol, and lots of cotton swabs, the CAS is all cleaned up and it basically looks like new again. We're gonna pull off the old O-ring off of this, but as I pulled it off, the ring just ripped, and it looks like it was pretty much disintegrating and brittle at this point. And this CAS O-ring is probably the most common oil leak spot in these engines, so I'm not really surprised by this. So I'm gonna put a very thin coat of oil on this thing to have it easily slide in place, and we're also going to completely clean off the area on the cylinder head of old oil, silicone, or anything else that might cause a leak if I just left it. So after the area is clean, we can put the CAS back in place, and then we'll screw the cap back down as well as the angle adjustment bolt in the back. The CAS should be angled to about where you noted it when you took it off, but if you don't remember, just put it roughly in the middle. We're gonna need to adjust the ignition timing anyway, so it just needs to be good enough for the car to idle, and we'll adjust the ignition timing when we turn on the car for the first time. And finally, you should set these top bolts to about 10 foot-pounds and we can move on. Wait! Before we do, let's plug this thing back in. I swear, forgetting to just plug something really simple back in has caused me so much anxiety when I'm doing stuff like this. We can put the refreshed coolant reservoir back in, again pushing the carbon canister out of the way and wiggling the reservoir in place. Lock it down with the 3 bolts we had removed earlier. I know it doesn't look that clean, the plastic is pretty yellowed, but at least it's squeaky clean inside. Next up is installing the new water pump, and the new pump that I ordered actually came with all of the new gaskets and even the O-ring, but you'll still need to have the proper silicone gasket on hand, like this one that's made by Permatex. It's specific for coolant components. We'll smear a thin layer of silicone on all of the mating surfaces of the gasket, and a little bit goes a long way. Putting globs of this stuff will squeeze out of the side, so I'm using a cotton swab to spread it out. Attach this pipe to the water pump and bolt it down just finger tight, and then give it a quarter turn. After waiting an hour, go ahead and tighten it all the way down. And this is all in the instructions on the back of the silicone gasket packaging, but I'm just reminding you. We'll also attach this rubber gasket thingy, I don't know what it's called, but it sits on top of the water pump. And like I said, this water pump that I bought came with all of this stuff, which is pretty awesome. We'll take off the old O-ring that was on the pipe that connects to the engine block, and make sure you clean off all of these surfaces, by the way, from old gasket and silicone. Those will cause leaks, and you really don't want to do this twice. After replacing the O-ring, we're also going to smear a thin layer of silicone on the mating surface of the engine block, which also helps to keep the gasket in place while you align the water pump. Of course, do the same thing on the water pump itself, and we'll also smear a bit where the water pipe fits into this flange with the O-ring. I'm not sure if this is necessary, but I figured it couldn't hurt. Now we can align the water pump to the block, also making sure that the pipe is inserted properly into the flange. Again, we can't tighten it down all the way immediately, just turn the wrench until you feel a bit of resistance and wait an hour for the silicone to harden. I know this is annoying, but go get breakfast or something, it's gonna be a long day. After waiting a bit, you can go ahead and tighten all the bolts down to 17 foot-pounds of torque. If you don't have a torque wrench, I strongly recommend you get one. It actually matters for proper assembly. We can now reinstall this pipe section back into the engine bay using the couple of bolts. We're also going to attach the first section of the new lower radiator hose back to the water pump assembly using hose clamps. I didn't actually bolt down this middle section firmly until I had the radiator hose fitted where I wanted it, and then I bolted it down. We'll get to the other piece of the lower radiator hose that goes actually to the radiator once we're ready to put the radiator back in. Now that we're done with this section, I'm going to reinstall all of the stuff that I had pulled out just to get an open work area for the water pump installation. Since I had pulled out the heat shield anyway, I decided to sand it down and paint the heat shield black with some high temp spray paint. I'm not entirely sure how well it's going to hold up, but you know, it does look a lot better for now. We'll also reattach the air box and a section of the intake air hose back in, making sure to reconnect the AFM or the airflow meter. And while we're at this section, we can also just go ahead and replace the engine air filter. Mine had this K&N unit, which is supposed to be reusable after a good proper cleaning, so I went ahead and did that off camera. It wasn't really even that dirty to begin with though. The filter casing is tightened down by 4 bolts, I believe. We're now going to reinstall the coolant neck or the lower thermostat housing, but before we do that, I'm gonna put this small hose back. I know I have to remove this later again anyway to do the timing stuff, but it's just so I don't forget about it. We can replace the O-ring, and I don't think any silicone is needed here, although if you want to put a thin layer down, I don't think it hurts. Again, just make sure that the mating surfaces are perfectly clean. We'll also reattach this metal plate or the engine cover. I'm curious as to why the engineers thought that this thing needed 6 bolts to hold it up when the radiator is held on by 2 bolts, but who knows. There's no torque specs for this, just put it on snug. We can now take out the old front crankshaft seal, and I took a hook-like tool that I had and I bent the sharp tip back so it doesn't scratch the engine block. and I was eventually able to pull out the old seal. But if you're going to try to do this, I would actually suggest that you buy a seal remover. It would make this a whole lot easier, and if you try to pry this out and end up scratching up the block, it's gonna leak, so I suggest that you buy the proper tool. Anyway, to install this, I just put a little bit of engine oil on the new one, and I found a socket that fits perfectly to push it flush. Okay, I bought a new crankshaft sprocket because I broke the old one trying to remove it, and here it is. We should be able to just slide this thing on and align it with the new Woodruff key also. It is recommended that you use a new Woodruff key and a new crankshaft bolt each time you do this, and I'm sure the small investment will go a long way. We can slide in the Woodruff key to properly align the sprocket, and you can't push it in all the way, but if you do this properly, it shouldn't matter. The Woodruff key is only supposed to be an alignment tool, and the bolt is what's holding the sprocket tight to the nose of the crankshaft. And speaking of the bolt, put some blue thread locker on that bad boy and tighten it down to 84 foot-pounds if you have a short nose crank, 120 if you have a long nose crank. I still have the engine in 5th gear with the handbrake on, so it shouldn't move around too much while you do this. We should also replace these old camshaft seals that are definitely leaking. I'm using the same hook tool. You can notice that the tip is bent back as to not scratch up the seat of the seals, but again, if you're doing this, just buy a seal puller. These were really stuck on there, and it was a little scary to do this without the proper tool. I got them out eventually though, and I put a little bit of oil around the seals. I put a little too much, don't let it drip like that, and I just pushed it in. I didn't have a socket large enough to push it in, so I just gently tapped them in, and that worked out fine. Here is the new timing belt kit that I ordered. It does come with all new pulleys and a spring, in addition to, of course, the belt. I suppose you could get away with using the old pulleys and the old spring, but if you're going to do this much work, why not just replace them? The new spring didn't come with this plastic casing I found on the old one, so I'll just slip it onto the new one. We're going to just loosely bolt the pulleys back for now. I'm starting with the left-hand side one, which is the one that's pulled by the spring. Hook the spring up first and then pull the pulley in place and hand twist the bolt in. The right hand side pulley doesn't have a spring attachment, so just bolt it in hand tight for now. I'm going to now install the camshaft gears back on, and the two gears are identical. It doesn't matter which one goes where as long as the I is at the 12 o'clock position on the intake side and E is pointing up facing you on the exhaust side. And I know I said this before earlier in this video, but I'm gonna get angry comments if I don't explain this again. I did not lock down the camshafts at TDC for reasons I explained already, but you should if you want to make this whole thing easier, especially if you don't have to replace the camshaft seals. Right now, I'm just trying to keep the camshafts from rotating so I can tighten the bolts down to 40 foot-pounds. I'm not trying to keep the camshafts perfectly still. We're gonna do one more thing before we can put the timing belt back on, which is to pull the tensioner pulley back all the way out and then locking the bolt so that the spring stays stretched at the maximum point. You won't be able to put the belt back on otherwise. We can now put the belt back on, and the easiest way that I found to do this is to use some locking clamps to hold the belt onto the camshaft gears at the position that I wanted in while I install the belt. And it's a little annoying and it can be difficult, so be patient with it. Once you think you got the belt exactly right, go ahead and loosen the tensioner pulley, give the engine a few rotations. By the way, don't forget to put the car in neutral to allow the crank to rotate. Get it back to TDC and see if everything's settled at the right place. You should see three things. One is that I is pointing straight up, 2, E is pointing straight up, and lastly, the crankshaft gear notch is right on the triangle marker. If all of these three things are true after rotating the engine a few times, you're good to lock in the tensioner pulley down. But if something is a little off, move the belt a tooth or two, rotating the engine again and check again. I know my I and E from this footage seems a little off the center peak, but that's just from the GoPro that I'm using. It's using a bit of a fisheye lens, so it looks a little off center, but it is pointing straight up. We're now going to put the plastic engine covers back on, and my old ones were pretty brittle and the rubber gaskets on them were just completely disintegrating, so I just went ahead and ordered some new ones. They do come with the rubber pieces already included, so that's pretty great, and I'm glad to have some more clearly visible timing markers on this new bottom engine cover. There's no torque specs for these, but they are plastic, so just use some common sense. I'm installing them bottom first, then the middle, then the top piece. And the three pieces kind of lock in together to form one engine cover, so make sure that they're properly fitted together. And there's nothing much complex about this part though, just don't forget any of the bolts. Let's also put this dust cover back onto the crank sprocket. Now that the timing belt is back on, we don't want to forget about these. We're now going to install the new thermostat, and this gasket that I bought, I don't think it requires silicone to seal properly, but hey, I'm gonna do it anyway. I'm just putting a super thin layer of silicone spread. I'm popping the new thermostat in and tightening the bolts down with my hand. And after about an hour to let the silicone gasket harden just a bit, and then I went ahead and tightened them down all the way with a socket wrench. Here is the cleaned up crankshaft pulley after it sat in the rust dissolving solution for a day and some hard scrubbing. I guess it counts as a lightweight pulley now. I'm sure it'll rust back up later since I didn't coat it with anything, but hey, it looks better than before. This just bolts up to the sprocket with the 4 smaller bolts that we had pulled out earlier, and don't forget the shim, by the way, that goes on there as well. Use some blue thread locker on these bolts and set it to about 10 to 15 foot-pounds. Since all these parts are slotted, there's not a chance you can install this at a wrong angle, but you should be able to see the timing marker on the pulley. Mine's a little hard to see right now, but it should be aligned to the 0 or T marker on the engine cover. We're now going to reinstall the valve cover back on, but before we do, make sure that the cylinder head surface is squeaky clean. I took about 30 minutes to scrape off all of the old silicone gasket stuff and to wipe it down, while making sure that nothing was falling into the head. I'm also putting a healthy squeeze of silicone sealant at these indicated spots where kind of the sharp angles occur. Not doing this will cause it to leak oil, and after all this time that I spent cleaning all these parts, I don't want to do this again. And here's some more close-up looks where the silicone sealant should be applied. Now I'm going to gently lower the valve cover back on, and I videoed the entire process of cleaning the valve cover up, painting it red, and putting the new valve cover gasket on, but I made a whole separate video about that, which you can watch if you want to. But the valve cover gasket installation itself is really self-explanatory, and I don't think I need to cover it in depth here. Just make sure that it's seated all the way in. After that, I just hand screwed all of the valve cover bolts back in to make sure everything's aligned really well, and to make sure that none of the bolts are getting cross-threaded. We're going to torque all these down to exactly 4.5 foot-pounds, or about 55 inch-pounds, which isn't much at all. In fact, over-tightening these bolts will most likely cause a leak. There is a very specific sequence you should follow, which is basically middle, or starting in the middle and going outwards and doing it again a second time around. Watch closely the sequence that I'm doing. Do it twice, don't over tighten, and everything should be good. And then we can move on to reconnecting some of the other stuff back onto this valve cover. So I'm just reinstalling the spark plug wire holders and the engine oil cap, which if I ever have like 20 bucks burning a hole in my pocket, I would love to get like a billet aluminum one, because this plastic one is kind of worn and ugly. I also replaced the PCV valve, so I'm reconnecting that with a new hose clamp, and I'm also reattaching and reconnecting this vacuum tube that again I had only removed to paint the valve cover. You probably didn't take yours off, so you can kind of ignore this part, but you know, look how pretty the whole thing looks. I think it looks great. At this point, I can just drop the spark plugs back in, and I'm putting the old ones back in because they only have a few thousand miles on them. And look, you should be more careful than I am just dropping those suckers in kind of roughly like that, but as long as the tip doesn't hit anything on the way down, they're probably fine. I checked the gapping on the spark plugs off camera, and they're still perfectly within spec. And it is definitely worthwhile checking the gaps, since improperly gapped plugs will cost you some power, and God knows we can't afford to lose any from these little engines. The plugs should be tightened to about 15 foot-pounds, but screw them in by hand first to avoid cross-threading. We're now going to put the ignition coil back, and remember to lock it down with the 2 bolts on either side of the ignition coil, which bolts it to the top of the valve cover, and there's that 3rd bolt in the back near the firewall that screws onto the cylinder head. Putting this bolt back in and tightening it is actually much easier than loosening it and taking it out, so it wasn't that difficult. And if you made it this far, this stuff is pretty much baby frolics at this point, and you got this. Just don't forget to plug the coil back in. And I didn't unplug any of the wires from the coil because I didn't want to remember which plug goes where on the ignition coil, but if you don't remember, the sequence reading it from left to right facing the car is cylinders 3, 2, 1, 4 for the 1.6 liters and 4, 1, 2, 3 for the 1.8 liters. By the way, fun fact, these engines fire the spark plugs in pairs, so 1 and 4 go together and 2 and 3 go together. So if you swap the placement between 1 and 4 or between 2 and 3, it actually shouldn't matter. We're going to put this water pump pulley back now. You can see that I cleaned it up and painted it. And by the way, I have this weird addiction to spray painting, so get used to that. There should be 3 bolts. Tighten those down to about 7 to 8 foot-pounds or about 80 inch-pounds. Now that the water pump pulley is back on, we can put the new accessory drive belts, starting with the alternator belt. This one connects to the rear groove of the crankshaft pulley, the alternator, and the water pump. And once the belt is on, you want to use the tension adjustment bolt on the alternator to pivot out the alternator until the desired tension is reached. And I'll mention this again for reference, you want the belt to flex about 1/4 inch inwards when you push it down pretty firmly with your thumb. Too loose, it'll slip and squeal, and too tight, and you'll eventually ruin the bearings on your alternator or the water pump. Once you have reached the desired tension, go ahead and tighten down the other 3 bolts that we went over in the disassembly phase. Now we can move to the power steering pump and the AC compressor belt, which again ties to the crankshaft pulley, just the front groove this time. Pretty much the same deal here. Use the tension adjustment bolt above the power steering pump to get to the tension that you want, and then bolt down the other nuts and bolts. Don't forget the one behind the power steering pump pulley, and if you need to rotate the engine again to get access to that one, go ahead and do so. Tension of the belt is the same. You need to have about 1/4 inch flex when you press it down with your thumb. It's not a bad idea to check the tension on these belts at least every time you change the oil, because these belts may stretch a bit, or maybe some of these pivot bolts may come loose, who knows. We are in the final home stretch of the reassembly. All of the difficult stuff is done, and now it's just about dropping stuff in and remembering to reconnect all the plugs and hoses. So we are going to speed it up a bit here, but if you paid close attention to the disassembly phase, this should all be a breeze from here on out. We're going to drop the older radiator back in with the 2 bolts securing it to the front frame, and I know that I said that I was going to be replacing this, but and I actually do have an aluminum radiator sitting in the garage, but I'm going to be running some chemicals to clean out the coolant channels, and I didn't want all of that gunking up the new radiator, so I'll just reinstall this old one for now. Do not forget to re-plug in the 2 fans. There should be 2 plugs, and don't forget the coolant overflow hose from the radiator neck to the reservoir. There is actually one thing that I did forget to reinstall earlier, and it's this wiring bracket that should go on one of the bolts on the thermostat housing, so that's what I'm doing right now. I know I probably should, but I don't want to take this thing off and put a new gasket in, so I'm just going to take out the bolt and torque it back in. But if this thing starts leaking, at least I'll know why, and it is a pretty easy fix since nothing needs to be removed to get access to this. Speaking of the wiring, don't forget to reconnect the coolant temperature sensor and another wire that runs to the power steering pump. There should be a little knob that you can plug it in on. I'm not sure what this wire does, maybe it's a sensor or just a ground, I'm not really sure. Staying on the thermostat housing, let's not forget to reconnect all the coolant hoses that connect to the neck, and then we can move to the bottom of the radiator to connect the new the lower radiator hose and then clamp it down. After that, I'm putting the front air hose back in, and if you have trouble with this part, just reference back to the disassembly phase of it. It is pretty straightforward as long as we remember to reconnect everything and to address all the hose clamps. And don't forget the vacuum tube that ran across the top of this housing to the the throttle body. And finally, we're going to be reconnecting the upper radiator hose running from the thermostat housing to the radiator, and we're all done with the reassembly. Just take a look around in the engine compartment at this point, not only to admire your work, but to check for any loose plugs that you forgot to reconnect or any loose hoses, leftover bolts or nuts, that's my biggest nightmare, or tools that you just forgot about, or anything like that. Things are always easier to disassemble than to reassemble because there's just things that you forget as you reassemble, which is why it helps to be meticulous and organized when you're doing work like this. If you do think you did everything correctly, go take a shower and sleep. You don't want to put any oil or coolant in this thing until all of the gaskets have hardened, so give it at least 24 hours before this next step. After waiting a day, we can go ahead and fill the engine back up with new oil and new coolant, but first I'll go ahead and replace the old oil filter, which can be found on the passenger side of the engine right in front of the starter. We'll go ahead and pop that off and screw on a new one. An oil filter shouldn't be screwed on tight with a wrench, by the way, just tightening it firmly with your hand is just fine, and it'll be easier to take off the next time you have to take this off. Alright, let's pour the new oil in. The oil capacity is 3.6 quarts for the 1.6 engine and 4 quarts even for the 1.8. You're probably going to need 10W30 oil, and while Mazda does provide a range of accepted viscosities for different climates and driving conditions, and some people like to use something like 5W30, slightly thinner oil to quiet the lifters down, for 99% of us, 10W30 is going to do the trick. But if you want to know exactly what's right for you, go ahead and do some research. We're now going to add some coolant in, and I'm just going to use some distilled water to fill up the radiator because I know how dirty the old coolant was, and it's just a train wreck in there. And I don't want to waste good clean coolant by mixing it with all the rust and smelly water that's in the block, and even distilled water is probably overkill in my case, and I could just use the water from the hose. I'm gonna have to flush out the entire system repeatedly later anyways, so I'm just gonna fill it up most of the way with distilled water, start the car and get the engine start to get warm, and then add a little bit more before closing up the radiator cap. So before I get to adjusting the ignition timing, I'm going to do a quick check on where the RPM is at idle, and I'm looking for 850 RPM. So I'm using this pretty neat timing light, which tells me the RPM just by hooking a clamp up around the first cylinder spark plug wire. And remember how I said the Miata coil actually fires 2 plugs at once? That effectively means that this reading is going to be twice higher than the actual RPM. So since I'm looking for 850 actual RPM, we're looking for a screen reading of 1700, and turns out we're pretty darn close to that already. But just to show you how you can adjust the RPM at idle, you can use a screwdriver to adjust the idler screw on the throttle body, and you can see that the RPM increases as I turn the screw. Now that we got the RPM where we wanted, we need to actually adjust the ignition timing, because when we replaced the O-ring on the CAS, we probably threw the ignition timing off. And I'll actually create a separate video just for this process, although I'm sure many exist already on this topic. It's not that simple, but here's the quick version. Get the car to operating temperature, turn the engine off, connect GND to TEN on the diagnostic box that you can find near one of the headlights using a bent paper clip. Point the timing light to the crank pulley to see what your timing is. The reading should be around 10 degrees, and if it's not, twist the CAS slowly until it is. If you want a little extra power, advancing the timing to about 14 degrees before TDC is widely considered as safe. I know this wasn't that helpful for a how-to on ignition timing, and it's mostly because when I cleaned up the crank pulley, the orange timing marker kind of got faded, so the footage wasn't really helpful here. So like I said, I'll be making a separate, much more detailed guide on this very soon after I capture some better footage, or you can just watch one of like the other dozen videos on this topic. This is mostly just a reminder for you to actually tune your car after doing all this hard work. Alright, I think that was pretty much everything. This video, although it took me a long time to make, was pretty fun, and I hope you guys enjoyed it and found it helpful. Be sure to check out the video description for product links to support the channel and for other relevant videos to help keep your Miata on the road in tip-top shape. Or, just have fun with it. Thank you very much, and see you guys again very soon.